Happy to have Eli Thorkelson presenting today. Eli received his PhD from the University of Chicago with a PhD entitled Hostile Futures, Radical Philosophy in the French University Movement of 2009. He's published on issues of precarity, on issues of graduate socialization in anthropology, on the theory classroom, and in general has written a lot about the tensions between political practice and practice in higher education. Today he's just joined us as well as a lecturer in social anthropology, and today he's going to speak to us based on a chapter of your forthcoming book entitled "Revolution Was Not on the Agenda: French Political Subjectivity After 1968." As with the seminars, and I know many of you are regular participants, the speaker speaks for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for questions. So thanks very much.
Hi. Yeah, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for introducing me, Bernard. I just came back because it seemed like it would be helpful to have the printout of the slides so that I can kind of keep track of what is coming next in the presentation. It's not really going to be a big PowerPoint presentation, but there will be some pictures and some texts to look at. So just to give a little bit of background before I start reading to you from basically the chapter that I'm trying to finish, kind of about the political situation in France in the philosophy department that I have written about after 1968. A bit of context. The first piece of context, I think, is that the book on some level is a critique of what you could call neoliberalization theory, which is a kind of approach to thinking about higher education, which I would describe as dominant these days. The kind of general paradigm being higher education around the world, in spite of having some empirical variations, basically it's becoming neoliberalized, and like this kind of general framework of there being various kinds of neoliberalizing processes suffices to kind of give a more or less exhaustive framework or even paradigm for thinking about contemporary higher education institutions. And I find this very kind of very unsatisfactory paradigm because there are cases that it cannot explain very successfully. So the case that I'm going to talk about is a case I think that is explained very poorly by kind of neoliberalization theory, if you could call it that. Neoliberalization doxa probably would even be the word for it. The irony only worsened by the fact that this normally passes itself off as critical discourse about higher education. So that's point one. And I think the second and more specific point about what this book is trying to do, which is a book about the philosophy department in France, which we're going to hear about in a second, is that it is trying to think about how utopian practices and subjectivities can prosper in normative and degrading environments. So the thought is, one of the expectations of kind of neoliberalization theory is that there are a set of norms which more or less govern higher education and shape the subjectivities of people in them and give you a role to play and a set of incentives to follow and so on, and a set of scripts to enact and so on and so forth. So if you kind of start out from this extremely normative point of view, you wouldn't expect there to kind of be utopian projects that are unrealistic and kind of unrealizable and that in no way kind of conform to this set of, incentive or performance-based kind of academic self that one is supposed to be enacting. So the question animating my book is, how does utopian practice still manage to kind of prosper in environments governed by very strong sets of often neoliberal norms and in environments that are often degraded because of financial crises and other kinds of material constraints on public higher education. So that was the background. Before I start reading, I'm also going to give, this was a piece of advice from Simone Becker, to kind of give a little historical kind of a little historical overview of what May 1968 represented in France. So we're just going to have about 3 or 4 minutes of kind of a little overview of what that amounted to. So that says the struggle continues. So May 1968 in France is often kind of characterized as the defining political moment of its generation. And certainly I think it was that for student activists, professors who were involved in the events, which amounts to 5 weeks more or less of kind of direct, often violent confrontation between what in French are called the forces of order, the police, and protesters, many of whom were students, but many of whom were also not students and were members of the general French population, or workers, in the highly fetishized kind of Marxian jargon of the time. And so for about 5 weeks, there kind of this increasing street unrest and a sense that the government is not able to contain it, and increasing efforts to kind of bargain with protesters and offer, for example, I found out recently that there was offered at one point a 35% hike in the minimum wage, which would not have been on offer under any other circumstances. And there's a kind of crisis in the economy where goods stop being delivered and food is difficult to procure in some places, probably mostly Paris. And there's just kind of an image of, at least, of the economy comes to a standstill. So just to kind of refresh people's memory of what this looks like so that we have a shared point of departure of some kind. The actual photographs typically look about like this. Sometimes they have more pictures of police and sometimes they have more pictures of protesters, but they're all kind of the same image of Paris. There's all these slogans which kind of have stayed with people. It's forbidden to forbid, all power to the imagination. A single non-revolutionary weekend is infinitely bloodier than a month of permanent revolution. Famously, the more I make love, the more I want to make the revolution, the more I make the revolution, the more I want to make love. So there's a kind of sexual politics which remained very kind of influential afterwards, and a kind of sexual, it's kind of corresponds to kind of sexual liberation in France. I think this might be my favorite. The walls have ears. Okay, that one's familiar from kind of secret police part, right? But your ears have walls. That requires like a moment's thought to kind of parse entirely what that is trying to say to you, which I think amounts to like you are a socially determined subject, and that might be something that you might want to rebel against. I think that is kind of the idea. And so importantly, I think that during May 1968, there's a sense that the revolution with capital T, capital R, was either happening or was completely imminent. There was a sense that authentically the French conservative Gaullist government might fall, and in a very usually not well theorized way, might be replaced with some other kind of more liberatory social order, which was not necessarily going to be, even though this is from a communist pamphlet, students and young people, we can be a great revolutionary force, was not necessarily a kind of traditional communist project, because at this point the Communist Party had become was perceived as a conservative force in French society, and in fact put a lot of effort into trying to stop the social movement of May 1968, and to get workers to go back to work. It's better to kind of stick with the script of more or less working within the system and waiting for some other moment of revolutionary possibility that was never all that well defined. So there's a big rebellion against the Communist Party, which produces all these kind of alternative leftist kind of loosely Marxian projects. Okay, so that is kind of the background of May 1968. Does anybody have any questions about that while we're here? Okay. I actually abhor reading from texts, so I'm going to do my best to force myself to actually do it, so as to kind of encounter what I'm trying to say with a bit more specificity than if I just speak extemporaneously. So there's and I'll say one more thing before I read my text. So one of the demands in May 1968 was for educational reform. Even one of the foundational demands was for educational reform. That says popular university. And one of the concessions that was made after the protests in the next few months was to create what was thought of as a popular university. And the specific site is called was in the Bois de Vincennes, which is kind of a park just east of Paris. And the idea was kind of to concentrate all the protesters outside of the city limits so that they would no longer trouble French public order by having protests like right in the middle of the city. And this was agreeable to many academic radicals at the time, because they were going to be given a kind of institutional purchase which they had not readily had anywhere else in France. This new university was constructed very, very, very rapidly, like in a period of a few months. The buildings were built, and the budget was approved, and staff were recruited. And it looked like this. I believe is famous for having the first daycare in any French university. And so this place 40 years later became my research site. So this is what the talk is about, is what became of this university, and in particular of its exceptionally left-wing philosophy department 40 years later. So the chapter that I'm going to read to you essentially is kind of the backstory to the political situation that I discovered when I did research in 2009, 10, and 11. And what I'm trying to figure out in my chapter, I guess, is how did one get from the sense that the revolution was basically happening to a much more kind of disappointed utopian project, where the expectation would be that one would continue to do utopian things in the university that many universities, including ours here, would probably not do, like allowing students to vote on policy questions at department meetings, for example. There's a kind of direct democracy tradition that is not very widespread, I think. But was nevertheless kind of not going to expect that the revolution was actually going to obtain, and that so they're in this sense it's going to continue being radical and kind of utopian, both terms which I would invite questions about, as both are quite nebulous terms on some level. Yeah, it's going to continue to be utopian, but kind of in a permanently disappointed fashion. Okay, without further ado, so how did disappointed utopianism form? If I'm reading too fast, someone please raise their hand and say you're reading too fast. Such historical questions presuppose a further conceptual question: how does any form of subjectivity come into being? And I depart here from the simple axiom that a subject procures its structure unevenly over the course of a given history. As Foucault put it at one point in talking about kind of in his paper about genealogy in Nietzsche, things have not a timeless and essential secret, but the secret that they have no essence, or that their essence was fabricated in a piecemeal fashion from alien forms. So one could say, drawing on this, that each subject form, such as that of being a utopian in this particular university, is a reaction to a historical experience, and through that to preceding forms of subjectivity. So forms of subjectivity are not sui generis, right? They're reactions to other kinds of historical events. So we can then ask, what is the structure of this reaction that organizes a given subject form? What is the concrete historical experience that prompted the reaction? And if the resultant subjective form is always a composite structure, what is the history of its constituent parts? So what I'm trying to trace in this chapter is a kind of historical genealogy of a disappointed utopian subject at Paris 8's philosophy department. Vincennes eventually was named University of Paris 8. So I'm going to constantly call it Paris 8 because that's how it's called these days. So a thing that as I set out in the introduction of my book, a disappointed utopian subject is one that is constantly disappointed by the repeated failure of a utopianism that it cannot not practice. Such a subject is organized by massive ambivalence, sometimes manifesting as critique or as reflexivity, as well as by an irreducible positiveness. It rarely owns up directly to its radical idealisms. Rather, it thrives on storing its positivity outside itself in the register of culture, collectivity, and social representation. A thing that I said when I was here 6 months ago for my job talk was a disappointed utopian can act like a utopian in the morning and a neoliberal bureaucrat in the afternoon. One can then ask, how does such a subject come into being? So what I'm proposing in this chapter is that disappointed utopianism emerged from a history of revolutionary philosophy in turmoil. In France's post-war intellectual milieu, philosophy was always already political, at least for Marxists, which were a major force in French philosophy, like Sartre has kind of a Marxist turn, for example. And philosophy as a discipline was often in crisis because it was being competed with by other disciplines, math and natural sciences in particular, and new social sciences. Public intellectuals like Sartre were devising new relations to mass media and even to television. Public universities were rapidly expanding, and as protests against Vietnam, against bourgeois conservatism, and against traditional education broke out into the student movement in 1968, radical politics crystallized around the trope of the revolution. So we're immediately obliged to trace the disappointed utopian subject back to the tumultuous experience of May 1968, and to the broader history of radical philosophy that emerged through 20th century French Marxism. Yet what I want to propose here today, if you like, is that the foundational event in this genealogy was not actually May 1968. What I want to propose is that the foundational moment in the history of this subject form was the loss of the revolution that occurred in its aftermath. The revolution in its fullest sense echoed across the Vincennes philosophy department's first decades, but as a lost object, getting more and more buffered and mediated, and forming an unreachable or even comic horizon. So now to talk about the revolution in France is to mark yourself as kind of archaic, like as belonging to this moment that is gone and is unrecoverable. So I think it's impossible to kind of return to that moment where the revolution had a kind of plenitude. And I don't know whether that's true in South Africa, but I think that this is true for kind of your standard academic liberals in North America, at least. So what I'm essentially going to propose in the larger chapter is that disappointed utopianism gained its structure through the convergence of 4 different processes. 1, disappointment and ambivalence flourished and multiplied at the newly established University of Paris 8. In an early moment, this was personified by the remarkable ambivalence of Michel Foucault. So we're going to spend about half the time talking about Michel Foucault's ambivalence. And in a second moment, disappointment crystallized around a short-lived adjunct, what's the South African jargon equivalent of adjunct? Contract worker, yeah, around a strike of contract workers in 1974. And then, so this is the main part that we're going to actually focus on and what I can read to you in the next 20 minutes. There are 3 other kind of major components of subjectivity formation that we're not going to have time to talk about. One is a kind of depersonalization, if you like, of utopian rhetoric, meaning that the department eventually started to produce kind of mission statements and other kinds of textual documents that amounted to saying, you can vest your utopian ideas here in this text. You don't have to kind of vest it in your person or in your psyche or in your subject, kind of in your interiority. So that's one way in which kind of utopianism gets collectivized. A third important kind of process is a kind of re-theorization of what it means to be a radical philosopher. So there's a lot that one can say about this intellectual history, which I'm not going to have time to get into, but there's kind of a long, to be in a discipline is to have a theory of your discipline. And to believe that one is in a radical discipline means having a theory of your discipline is having some kind of radicality. And I'm not saying that everybody here must say like, aha, I identify with this. But just, try to imagine that if one were to be in that situation, one would need a theory of what it was to be in a radical discipline. So there's quite a lot of intellectual labor that goes into theorizing what it is to be doing radical philosophy in France. And last point, there's a kind of a new form of self-consciousness that starts to appear in this department as its founding figures basically die and retire. So the last kind of major constituent of disappointed utopianism as a form of subjectivity emerges kind of through this self-consciousness that comes across through loss. So if you're in a department that has been founded on certain great men, and it's very masculinist in a way that I would also very much invite questions about, then when the great men are gone, this kind of elicits a new kind of subjective focus on what it was to be in this object that created these great men and was centered on them. So I apologize for those parts of the argument being left off. So I wanted to give you, very briefly before we talk about Foucault, a little hint of kind of what it meant for the revolution to get lost as an object. Let's just skip ahead a little bit. So there's a famous Trotskyist intellectual called Daniel Ben-Said, who was originally hired as a contract worker and rapidly became permanent staff. I don't know whether people can read that, but I'm going to read it out loud anyway. So he was interviewed, and he says, I was a part-time worker at Vincennes, in fact, at least until 72. I didn't show up scrupulously for the most turbulent moments, the ones that were somewhat frenzied. So this is all like right after 68, right? Like the far left groups were expecting the revolution to still happen. So after 72, the Maoist thrust died down, but beforehand we went through some overwhelming years where there were bombardments of little red books at the General Assembly. I think this literally means that people came with many copies of the little red book and hurled them at people who they thought were too reactionary. Our Trotskyist group was a small minority, and there was a sort of Maoizing exaltation with all different variants. The campus was periodically occupied, we witnessed a sort of chaos as well, politically, happening around the facade. I think this means direct action, basically. And conflicts a little later around the Department of Psychoanalysis. So Ben Said continues, we thought that in Europe we were headed toward explosive situations. But after, finally, the revolution not having taken place, we had to think about regularizing. It became clear that we wouldn't be political for life. So Parasite gave us the occasion to have an interesting job that left plenty of free time for activist activity. But that only came later. There was never a career project. So let's just pause to kind of think about the kind of experience that's being evoked in a little testimony like this. The idea would be, I think, authentically actors like Ben Said, who is not in the kind of the most kind of overtly radical in these days were these Maoist groups that authentically did things like disrupt classes of professors who they thought were too right-wing, and kind of in general developed kind of a project whose premise was like, let's destroy the university. The university is an organ of capitalist reproduction, and what we should be doing is not to reform the university. We should get rid of the universities and stop it from functioning altogether. In the early years of this department, Maoists, in fact, were probably the most politically dominant force in philosophy. Everybody is looking at me with this look that's like, I cannot picture what you were talking about. To be fair, it's hard to picture what this must have been like, because I think it's very alien to most of our own lived experiences. Was anybody here in France in the late 60s? No.
Could you just say something about the Maoist press? Because when I was there in 2000, this is when I first heard about all these 60s and early 70s academics turning to Mao. So maybe speak to the significance of Mao and disappointment with the kind of the Soviet.
Well, I guess so I have not done like a ton of research kind of into the details of Maoist collectives at this point. But I think that there was kind of a fantasy, of a kind of cultural project that one may not have been able to find in Eastern European Soviet doctrine. Often was not coupled to any intensely intimate knowledge of what actually was happening in China. So it became, I think, kind of an optimal object of projection. One could imagine that it was kind of a maximally radical situation. And was, I guess, coupled to a kind of intellectual avant-gardism as well. So there's kind of, there's kind of an effort to sometimes, they're still thinking kind of broadly kind of in a Marxist and psychoanalytic compass, but to definitely not to kind of think in terms of orthodox Marxism and kind of to develop new avant-garde languages, sometimes which had to do with literature and kind of avant-garde writing. And so the people who you find being most moved by this are kind of avant-garde writers and psychoanalysts, and often like quite a lot of quite young people, like 20-year-old people who I think were kind of swept up in a kind of collective excitement. I realize that doesn't like really answer the question, but that's kind of my impression of what the Maoist project kind of amounted to. Okay, so in any case, what one can kind of derive from this Ben Said excerpt, and again, everyone will just have to make a great effort of kind of imagination to picture themselves in this turbulent kind of post-revolutionary, except that there was no real revolution moment. Everyone will have to picture that, and then we'll have to picture Ben Said having this experience, which I think was typical even of Maoists, of finding that in fact the revolution was not happening, and that lots of these people, as they reached 30, eventually found that they were having slightly more conventional lives after all, sometimes with children, or marriages, or partners, and kind of experiencing social reproduction and probably the need for some kind of steady income in a way that in their early 20s they may not have needed or felt that they needed. And so you can kind of see in Ben Said this sense of things kind of happening, how can I put this, without intention. It's as if one had not planned to kind of have to regularize. One had not planned to have to become a kind of an academic professional and have a career. And one was happy that there was this marginal institution where one could get a job for life because one is a civil servant if one works in has a permanent job in French public higher education, where one could, continue to be an activist if one liked, and could kind of have a comfortable job without too much suffering from kind of work discipline. So that kind of is the broad trajectory of this place. And what I want to talk about kind of briefly is these two moments that I find kind of emblematic of the development of ambivalence and kind of friction, I guess, in the project, the kind of breakdown of these radical aspirations. So Michel Foucault is the first department chair of this place, and was quite a bit older than other activists because he's 41 when he's appointed, and most of the people who are involved in 68 were, roughly between 20 and 25 years old. So he's 15 years older than the rest of them, and is not actually in France in 1968. He's actually in Tunisia, teaching there. And he said some interesting things actually about his experience of 1968 when he came back. So I'll just read you what Foucault said about 1968, retrospectively from the 70s. When I came back to France in November 1968, said Foucault, I was rather surprised, astonished, and even disappointed, given what I had seen in Tunisia. The struggles, whatever may have been their violence, their passion, in any case didn't involve the same price, the same sacrifices. There was no comparison between the Latin Quarter barricades in France and the real risk of getting 15 years in prison like in Tunisia. People in France talked about hyper-Marxism, the unleashing of theories, anathemas, splitting into tiny groups. It was exactly the opposite of what had excited me in Tunisia. Maybe that explains the way I went through things from then on, out of sync with these boundless discussions, this hyper-Marxization, this unstoppable discursivity that was key to university life in 1969, especially life at Vincennes. So I guess you could say, to apply to Foucault, Marxian term that he would probably never have used it. He was a bit alienated, in fact, by 1968, and came back kind of to this contradictory position of being the leader of a bunch of radicals who were much more subjectively committed to a radical project than he was himself. And he rapidly left, finding a much more conventional academic job at the pinnacle of French academia in the Collège de France. As he was on his way out, he gave like a denouncing interview to the newspaper. And that says The Trap of Vincennes, in which he said basically like, look, you set up this university that's supposed to be experimental, and now all that the government does is basically criticize it for being too Marxist and being too experimental and too unconventional and too out of control. We can't win, basically, in this university because we've been given an impossible task and we're not allowed to kind of go through with it. And so this is the first time that there's anything like a public denunciation of this university by any of its own partisans. I think before that, discourse around this university more or less consisted of saying, the kind of conventional media would say, look at these kind of these unruly radicals. But that's quite different from having someone within the project kind of denounce it in public and denounce it as contradictory. So what's interesting about Foucault is Foucault did go to the protests, and his partner was deeply involved in Maoist political activity at the time. But the thing that I wanted to read to you is an undated text from Foucault, which must have been from 69 or 70, where he says, it's written somewhere, preserved somewhere in the archive. Foucault says, Monsieur, you can see it's very masculine because Monsieur is strictly for men. I can't call you comrades, being a scoundrel myself. I ought to say that all professors are crap. They're always late and make a profession of cultivating lateness. Today's movement against the current conditions of the world will be their death, which is why we're working to maintain what exists. The product we're producing is scholarly lies, that's what the state is paying us for, and that's what our scholarly student monkeys are so eager to acquire. The better to become practitioners of lives themselves on behalf of the political parties and militant groups that are there to modernize capitalism. We are thinkers underwritten by the state, but I ought to say that our most worthy activity over the last 50 years has been to try to hide from the younger generations the real history of the workers' movement and its most grandiose moments, Kronstadt, Turin in 1920, which I have no idea what that actually is, the Commune of Spartacus, and finally Barcelona in 1936-37. I'm ashamed, and this I think is kind of the most important moment of this text. I'm ashamed, but this shame will not make me into a revolutionary. Monsieur, I salute you, Michel Foucault. So, all of us who are university teachers, I invite us all to imagine standing and delivering a text like this to a group of student activists. I find that a vertiginous thing to try to imagine. So, I mean, this is a parody. I think that the first thing, perhaps people are not that familiar with Foucault as as a person, but Foucault is not a Marxist, right? Foucault is deeply skeptical of kind of Marxist politics and language, and never identified with them in any kind of like strong subjective form after he left a very, very short flirtation with the Communist Party in the 50s. And so this is essentially is a kind of parody text that consists of saying, you know, look, I will ape the vocabulary of Marxism kind of as a way of manifesting to you kind of what Marxists would say about why I can't be a revolutionary since I'm a professor. Here's what Marxists say about professors, that they're paid by they're state functionaries who are paid to produce slides on behalf of the reigning social order. Obviously, this is a thought that, you know, there's a grain of truth, if you like, in this theory about what the social functions of academics are or can be. But in any case, I think for Foucault, it's a complete parody. But I think that it's a kind of parody of Marxist language that nevertheless manifests this kind of intense ambivalence about being in this role of being the kind of older, conservative, not really conservative, but relatively conservative compared to these kind of Maoist groups, manager of a bunch of teaching staff who largely were far more kind of directly political, radical, if you like, than Foucault was himself. And you can kind of imagine him in a text like this, kind of begging off, like, look, I'm not going to be at the front of the protest. Look, I'm a scoundrel myself. I can't be comrades with you. All professors are crap. So it's both a thought I think that Foucault, you know, was making fun of, and also that he seems to have partly been kind of authentically aligning himself with. So what I argue about Foucault kind of in more detail in the chapter is that this is kind of a precursor to forms of ambivalence about this project of being a radical philosopher that were going to become more and more and more theorized as time went on. So I don't have time to tell you about how they became more theorized as time went on, but I think that Foucault is kind of the canary in the coal mine of this kind of intense ambivalence. Like, look, I am paid by the state apparatus to work in the university. I am not going to be a revolutionary because, you know, even if I'm shamed. Because by the logic of this argument that I don't even completely buy, that I'm still voicing for you, I can't be a revolutionary because I'm a professor, a paid professor. Okay. So this is what I have. This is the 5-minute version of what I have to say about Foucault as a kind of ambivalent actor in this place. Don't think that I have printed in the slides for you kind of the any of the kind of relevant quotes from the next thing that I was going to talk to you about. But one of the things that happened in this philosophy department is that it had a massive contract employees. So in the early 70s, it kind of proliferated contract teaching employees, typically paid to teach one class at a time in any given semester. Apparently there were at least 50 by the early 70s. And after a few years, and Foucault had left, and there's a lot of internal politics in the university, and budget issues as well, I think, that 1 year, if you like, in 1974, there's an effort to kind of rationalize this large population of contract teachers. And what's quite interesting to me about this, let me just find for you my list of faculty at this place. So here are some teaching staff in 1969. There's Foucault, there's Ben Said, a Trotskyist, there's Jacques Rancière, who rapidly becomes a kind of renegade Althuserian. There's Badiou, who's a Maoist. There's Etienne Balibar, who's from the traditional Communist Party and therefore perceived as reactionary. There's René Girard, who's a kind of a queer anarchist. There's Judith Miller, who became notorious for saying that her role was to destroy the capitalist university, and was in fact gotten rid of by the government because it was thought to be unacceptable for someone to say to the press, look, I'm a professor paid to destroy the university. So it's also Jacques Lacan's daughter. So this is the kind of more or less the senior teaching staff. And within a few years, they had a desire to kind of clean up the ranks of their contract workers. There were allegations that the contract workers did not actually show up to teach. And so there was a criterion which was proposed, which was that everyone who does not show up to teach is going to get fired. Contracts will not get renewed. What's interesting about this is that it rapidly became kind of a moment of political selection, where some people who are now known for having, who are idealized, in fact, in discourse about French philosophy as having been the quintessential kind of noble, rebellious, philosophical heroes, Ben Said, for example, or no, I shouldn't say Ben Said, Rancière, for example, or Badiou, end up on a committee that's tasked with picking which of their precarious contracts, in fact, to axe. By some accounts of this, it's not a well-documented moment, but by some accounts of this, their criteria for who to keep were basically who were their friends, who were people who were politically congenial to them, and then on the list of people who to axe, who were people who were friends of people who they were not so politically close to. Interestingly, this provoked a kind of strike against this group of people who now is lionized basically as kind of a set of philosophical heroes. So let me just see if I can. Here's what a co-organizer of the strike of these contract workers had to say. One member of the teaching staff denounced the firing operation as a group of Maoists playing favorites, and he lamented that this had created a quote-unquote Jacobin Bolshevik-style normalizing operation instead of the banal measure of workforce rationalization that had originally been intended. So a co-organizer of the strike would retort 40 years later that whether it was a banal administrative measure or a Jacobin Bolshevik-style normalizing operation, I'll quote, the situation for those removed would have been the same, deprived of their jobs and of their meager livings. And she observed a gendered subtext to the affair. You fired all the girls, she recalled telling the department chair who replaced Foucault. It's interesting because almost all of these contract workers had some kind of personal connection to the permanent staff members in the department. This probably is how they managed to get fired to begin, or hired, I should say, hired to begin with. There's kind of an immense force of networking. But the the argument about this department that the adjunct is the North American, the contract worker organizer put forth was, I'll read to you again. The adjunct teachers, precarious teachers, I should say, contract teachers, were not the professor. I wrote this in North America, right? So it's all in North American vocabulary. The contract teachers were not the professor's personal associates, she declared. They were each supposed to represent the political stripes of activist groups linked to May 68, former Althusarians, Maoists from the Gauche Proletarienne, Trotskyists, and anarcho-deserents, as we ironically called them. The adjuncts didn't do much at the department, but they were supposed to work, which at the time meant political organizing elsewhere. Their integration in the department was based on their militant activity, supposed to be representative of the social movement, a source of experience, of knowledge. The philosophy department was made to be a resonance chamber, a political forum for the major events of the time. That was the logic of hiring. So you can kind of imagine a situation where this big social movement has just happened, and a bunch of radicals, if you like, are kind of given a department to do what they like with, for the most part, other than give newspaper interviews saying that they're to smash the capitalist university. That was too far. And they hire a bunch of people who are supposed to be activists, representative of different stripes of activist organizing in this period. And then they're kind of axed for some kind of measure of workplace rationalization / internal politics. It's really impossible in hindsight to say. So there's a moral to this story, which is kind of the moral that I'm going to end with, which is that in the aftermath of this, so there's a protest by the temporary workers where they go to the upper management and say, like, look, this is unfair. Look, you have to defend us against being fired by our colleagues. And the upper management did defend them against being fired by their colleagues, and so the mass firing was averted, basically. I think some of them may have left anyway, but some of them also were given were promoted as a kind of irony. They were promoted to permanent positions. So the strike, if you like, was successful. It's a little bit obscure in the documentary record what exactly the strike consisted of, other than going to the senior management and complaining. Some people call it a strike, some people call it other kinds of protest. But the moral of the story is that this group of radicals who work in this department, Rancière is an excellent example of this, but you also an excellent example of this. Their reaction to having their kind of firing project fail was to say, well, basically, the hell with it. We're not going to be interested in the politics of our department anymore. we're going to abandon the politics of our department and just treat it as a kind of workplace where we show up to teach and then get out of as fast as possible. And for literally decades afterwards, these people have kind of renounced thinking of their workplace as a political space. So even though it's hard for me to write about this event because I don't have like a massive useful documentary evidence and it's quite contested, what seems to be indisputable is that the very eruption of workplace politics in this very left-wing philosophy department, ironically, was also the moment of mass depoliticization of its own permanent teaching staff. As if the kind of the emergence of opposition within this space where everyone is supposed to share certain kinds of political ideals, and if you don't, you might be pressured to do that. If the eruption of kind of difference and protest within that just meant, that the project should be kind of abandoned wholesale, and one is going to kind of retreat into a kind of anarchist individualism where one just teaches and takes one's salary and is indifferent to institutional stuff. Not totally coincidentally, this department was not accredited to grant degrees in France for about 15 years after this. The French government initially said, look, you're too Marxist for us to accredit your philosophy degree program. But what ended up happening was that the permanent staff were not too fundamentally kind of just accepted that and kind of went on with life in the absence of being able to give students a credential that would be recognized elsewhere in France. The sequel to that story, incidentally, is that a massive flux of post-colonial subjects came to this department because they were not suffering from the fact that the degree was not accredited kind of by the French national accreditation body. And so the department then survives kind of as a kind of point of conjunction of French, largely white radicalism and massive flows of post-colonial students who kept the enrollments up and therefore kind of the budget in okay shape and things like this, resources continuing. Okay, so those are kind of the two major historical moments that I'm trying to evoke for you very, very briefly. I think rather than kind of return to the conceptual question about subjectivity formation that I started out with, I'm just going to leave it at that for now and open up for questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
I tend to be a bit like hyperactive when I'm actually like, unlike the job talk when I'm like fully awake and conscious. So if it's too hyperactive, I can kind of slow down and repeat things.
So thank you. I invite questions. As we normally would take them in a bunch. And please introduce yourself. So who has thoughts, comments, invitations to elaborate, perhaps, or to say more about the project? I'm looking for hand. Please. Thomas has
Yeah.
Thomas is next.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, very fascinating. Obviously, very relevant to a lot of people, and maybe people that can actually imagine more than you expect. Given that in South Africa, this is a discussion about a revolution. Yeah, that is disappointing. I'm just wondering about whether the way you're thinking about, say, it's interesting for me that you're dealing with a time and a phenomenon, historical phenomenon, an event, but you're also dealing with theorists at that time. And I'm interested in more about maybe I'm interested in I say, for example, this question of Foucault. I always, where I understand it is that it was the failure of the students that gave rise to the later Foucault. That it was his disappointment by the protests in Europe that were happening in Italy and France, which basically was for him the end of the Marxists, the Marxist utopian project. And so his response, the way I see it here, is basically saying, of course, we are agents of the state, like Foucault. You are basically being producing lies, producing facts, right? So in that sense, I'm wondering to what extent the theorists, it's almost like, in your narrative, it's like the theorists are like Foucault and Rancy are like, oh, well, sorry, we're going to stay out. But if we look a couple of years later with Foucault's governmentality and the whole theory of neoliberalism, shouldn't we, don't you see this as being formed by this actually?
Yeah, I think, okay, I will wait, okay.
Yeah. Take a cluster.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Are you done? See?
Yeah, sure.
That's a marvelous question.
Just to follow up on that, I guess is maybe less pointed, but if I can just ask you to perhaps links. You've given us some sense of the sort of pragmatic politics of the department at that time, but I'm struck by the content of some of these philosophical debates. Can you give us a bit more of a flavour of some of the? mean, surely there's a relationship between the politics of the moment and the substance of what the concepts they're arguing about, and also the kind of broader political context, which the kind of growing disillusion with Marxism as a kind of as a political problem in that particular part of Europe, as opposed to a kind of English Marxism, British Marxism, I should say, which had a very different kind of trajectory and was going in a different direction. So, I mean, I think having a better sense of that will help us to relate some aspects of this to the South African context, where distinguishing between the language of the revolution and the revolution itself is starting to kind of have effects in South Africa.
Any more questions? Sure.
Piggybacking on that, perhaps to start, but I'm sure.
that you are.
Sorry. Now I've lost my thought. Oh, no, it's about students as a revolutionary force. I mean, because that is surely one of the conceits of students.
Yeah.
Or how one thinks about it, and sort of speaking at the time one thought of oneself as a student radical, if not as a revolutionary. And of course one's now a professor, so who's often late. But it is the wider implications around how one thinks about students, and of course that relates to the South African context at the moment. So a lot of what you're saying, I think, is resonant.
Yeah.
You want to take those two?
Well, any more would be impossible.
Be realistic.
Yeah, so I guess to answer in order, Shahid, I think, Foucault says in interviews, I think, that his later work was indeed informed by kind of this moment of political tumult. I don't have any reason to kind of be skeptical about that kind of taken in isolation. And certainly Foucault is interested in trying to do politics largely around prisons, I think, really, in ways that related to discipline and punish. So in that sense, sure, Foucault says that, the later work came out of that. But I mean, I think that one has to kind of contrast this with the fact that Foucault's kind of institutional strategy, if you like, was to kind of aspire to be at the top of the highly elitist French academic system in a role where you don't really have students. Actually, this does get to the question about students. By design, all you do is you just go and give these lectures, and people come or they don't come. There's lots of stories about how Foucault actually kind of loathed crowds that erupted around him and tried to arrange the lectures to be more or less in the Stellenbosch timetable of starting at 8 in the morning to deter attendance. So I think, I don't have any. I don't have any kind of quarrel with Foucault's claim that he was kind of infected by this moment. I think he was infected ultimately kind of less by universities themselves as a site of politics or political struggle, and more kind of by I think more by these kinds of topical and not kind of non-traditional, decentered political zones that were prisons and maybe were queer politics. So I guess what one could read that text that I found is Foucault trying to interrupt the kind of privileged status of universities as the site of revolutionary political subjectivity, and to try to go somewhere else. He's notorious also for having said by the late 70s that the question is trying to figure out whether the revolution is desirable, which I think is really just a way of saying the revolution as formulated by French Marxists is not desirable at all, because it will kind of be an authoritarian venture. I mean, that's not literally what he says, but I think that's pretty straightforwardly what was meant. And so I guess, I don't really have more of an analysis of Foucault than that Foucault as an intellectual did things that were somewhat distinct from Foucault kind of as an institutional strategist, as a strategic actor moving through higher education. and his objective as a strategic actor moving through higher education seems to have been to aspire to, a research-only job where you give the minimum amount of lectures and are free of the burden of managing the student masses and their unruly kind of nature. So anyway, it would take a psychoanalyst to kind of go farther than
I was
that.
just trying to suggest that maybe an alternative
Yeah.
theory would actually suggest that actually maybe he was acting very much within his own theoretical frame when he was doing all of this. So later on,
Well,
with
but
the
then-
Iranian
yeah.
revolution, is when he suddenly then supports the revolution. So there's something about how he sees Europe and how he sees
Yeah.
modernity
Yeah.
and the institutions of modernity. And so he looks at Tunisia different to the way he sees France. I'm just suggesting that there's another way of looking at Foucault as a person with these other responses. I mean, one of Tunisia is interesting. It's not just, I think, for me, not just the real revolution. It's actually because Tunisia is outside of Europe, so it's on the margins, and so the archive of European power is not necessarily. So he looked to these spaces.
Yeah,
That's what
I think
and
sure,
later on,
yeah.
he tells us, well, actually,
Yeah.
the world is only liberal. This is what we're going to become, individuals, governments.
Yeah.
And he was that. So it's like this, I see more consistency. That's what I'm suggesting. So.
Well, I guess it's so that, I mean, I'm just going to, before I get to the other questions, I'm going to say another word about Shahid's question. The question of what to do methodologically as a kind of historical ethnographer of people like this is a real problem, because the volume of stuff written by these kinds of intellectuals is such that one person is not going to sit down and kind of assimilate all of it. I've certainly not read everything that Foucault has written, and I probably won't, because there's a mass of it, and I think that my theory of subjectivity is kind of as one thoroughly permeated by situations, and as one that one has to kind of read in terms of their situational responses, and not in terms of their kind of longer term biographical coherence or even theoretical coherence. And in that sense, one could write an intellectual history of the site that I'm writing about, and it would look very, very different than the kind of thing that I am writing, which, like you were saying, is kind of about organizational politics, and not about these kind of longer term intellectual trajectories. I think that if I were to write more about people's longer term intellectual trajectories, people would say, aren't you an ethnographer? Like, this doesn't seem like ethnography if what you're writing is an intellectual history. So what I find myself fighting against every time I sit down, especially in this particular chapter, I find myself fighting against the urge to kind of do intellectual history. And maybe that rules out the possibility of kind of the reading that you're suggesting, which isn't to say that it's wrong. That may also have addressed about half of Thomas's question, I think, which was about, what is the substance of philosophical debates at this point. I will say one other thing about this, which is that I'm not too sure that in the department that I'm writing about, Foucault ended up kind of being a person whose intellectual work was necessarily regarded as kind of the quintessence of liberatory philosophy. The people who I think had more of a kind of immediate existential appeal to students at this point were more like Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. I think this was considered to be kind of, one person described it as a leftist liquidation of leftism, because it talks quite a lot about the kind of, the potential fascism imminent within certain kinds of liberatory projects, even while also setting itself against a different kind of fascism, which is inherent in kind of the state apparatus and the state power. So there's that, and there are some other less well-known books. Well, I think another book that to me seems to kind of crystallize the state of radical thinking, if you like, in this department at this point, is when Rancière sits down to kind of trash Althusser. That, I think, was a book that was very widely, it's in a book called Althusser's Lesson, if anybody is curious. That, I think, was kind of taken as saying, look, these people who are presented as these kind of radical theorists, themselves they're kind of mandarins. Themselves they're kind of in these positions of power, telling us how we should interpret the world, and what we must do is kind of get away from this kind of position of the subject who is supposed to kind of have, if not absolute, at least sufficient knowledge about society to kind of be in a critical and higher stance with relation to it. And so the sense of, with a lot of criticisms of kind of the micro power relations among teachers and students, and among Althusserian people like Althusser, who claimed a certain kind of epistemic privilege, and the underlings who are being told who they were and how to kind of what to believe and how to be a Marxist or whatever. So I think that yeah, there's a series of books which kind of become increasingly self-critical. And so to the extent that I have written about them, what interests me about them is kind of less the broad conceptual architecture of what intellectuals were writing in the early 70s, and more kind of how they came to objectify their own political experience in their own political context, in their own political institutions. And largely this was kind of self-critical, or critical of people who are very close to them. And this actually gets to kind of the question about the broader political context as well, because the thing that the early 70s is, or the early mid-70s is known for in France, maybe I should just say that the 70s is known for in general, is kind of the theatrics of ex-radicals renouncing their former radicalism and saying, you know, look, apparently the Soviet socialism is a totalitarian nightmare. Look, Maoism was a crazy idea, and I can't believe that my 20-year-old self or whatever actually did it, and it was very bad. So there's kind of a penance or something that's almost Catholic, if you like, that starts to emerge in the 70s, and a thing that was very grating, I think, for those who remained relatively true to this kind of project of radical philosophy, was that the people who publicly renounced radicalism, Marxism, or whatever, Maoism in particular, ended up getting on television and having their books become bestsellers and kind of were a media sensation. They're called the nouveau philosophes. That was the label by which they've become known. So there's kind of there's kind of a long process, if you like, of de-Marxization in France, which you have to read, I think, historically is related to the long-term decline of the Communist Party in France as well, which, if nothing else, made a great punching bag for this generation of radicalism, whose successive generations did not really even have that around us, this kind of point of departure. So I think, I guess I would say that kind of the broader political context in terms of intellectual debates having to do with this site anyways, is that of kind of penance and slow kind of de-Marxization. I mean, there's a number of other things one can say about kind of broader social politics in France and things at this point, but I don't have in my head kind of a lecture to give about how that fits into the site. So lastly, Cheryl's question about students as a conceited revolutionary force. No, the conceit being that students are a revolutionary force. Well, what becomes interesting nobody has taught me how to kind of do historical ethnography. I have kind of invented it for myself going along, given the documents that are basically available about the period that I'm interested in, just university in the 70s. What seems to have happened is the people who left the most documentary trace were basically academics. The teaching staff have been interviewed, and the interviews from the 70s are in the archives, and you can find them. And there is not a huge documentary record of kind of average students to look at from this department, really, or elsewhere. So what I have to work with, I guess, is kind of the very romanticized recollections, often of people who were students then and now are about 65 or 70 years old, and who kind of remember this university as having been a very romantic, and often remember it as having been a very romantic and kind of effervescent, beautiful place in the early 70s, free of many kinds of traditional hierarchy, if nothing else. And then these interviews with these people who are on the payroll, if you like. And so the way that student activists are represented in the materials that I have, it's always something shifty about throwing questions back to the limitations of one's data, but in any case, that's what I'm doing. The students are kind of represented just kind of as types. So you'll hear about, like, our Maoist group did protest X, Y, and Z or something like this. we occupied a general assembly, we prevented the person affiliated with the reactionary communist party from having his course or lecture or whatever. And it's hard for me to access kind of student lived experience or even student consciousness more than that. Probably, I mean, I think that someone could probably go and access more of it than I have, but in any case, the documents that are readily accessible to me don't do that much. I think that said, probably it's a mistake to kind of draw too strict a line between students and teachers, because the people who were students literally in 1968 became teachers very, very rapidly. So that largely is the people who would have become this population of contract teachers. They would have been students like very recently beforehand, and I suspect most of them did not have doctorates. They may not have had kind of a second cycle credential either. I'm not sure about that. I don't think they were hired because of their degrees. So I think the line between students and not students was kind of porous, and part of the reason why there's a lot of debate over what it means to be a professor is that it's a lot of people becoming professors who had not been professors like a year earlier, or 2 years earlier, or 3 years earlier. And so the thing that I have become more interested in is, you know, when people who were in active protest against the professoriate find that they're teaching classes by the mid or late 70s, it's interesting to me to see how do they react to that. What kind of guilty consciousness or lack thereof do they kind of deploy in negotiating their change of status? Does that answer your question? Yeah. Well, that's the answer kind of in terms of the archival basis of the project, at least. Do you
follow-up question?
Yeah. Can we have a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure. Then sure, I have a follow-up question for Lloyd and Rob. I have a question that I can also ask that later. So let's sure.
Well,
Since
I suppose it's around your methodology. Because I suppose my question, and possibly Thomas's, I'm not sure, I was thinking more about larger political, economic context, etc., what's going on elsewhere, what is happening in Eastern Europe at that time that's influencing how people are looking at Soviet-style communism,
Sure.
the Vietnam War, North America, so all those kinds of other strands, and of course what's also happening within capitalism itself.
Yeah.
You know, so it's around. So it's a question around your sort of ethnography of and how you versus political economy, perhaps, or how you think, how you negotiate that.
I will indeed say another word about that.
Lloyd?
Rob, I think was before me.
Okay, Rob.
Thanks for a fascinating talk, and I think one of the things that I found really interesting about it was the way in which you're sort of engaging with the individuals in a sense, and their investments in versions of radicalism and denouncing versions of radicalism, and the relationships with students and how they sort of construct themselves. And I found that really, really fascinating. And it sort of raised for me a kind of question about one of the things which I think was conspicuously absent from that was you talking about yourself. You know, you're talking about the people you're researching in very personal ways. You just don't really feature, and it feels odd actually. And in terms, I was thinking, in terms of like, well, why are you doing this project? What's in it for you? You know, are you a disappointed utopian or what? You know, and which is you can come out here and kind of also perhaps in relation to the historical ethnography too, that's what about the kind of relationships established with the people that you were talking to and doing research with, and how did they see you?
Lloyd?
I wanted to just revisit your opening comment about this being a critique of what you call neoliberalization theory.
Yeah.
Which you kind of present as a kind of a metadoxis. And you also refer to this as kind of a case that is not explained. So I think the thing is, in this context, I was not appreciate is how different the French university system is to the American one that we also follow. So I guess Vincennes is a university, so maybe you could speak to that. I mean, universitaire in the sense of not a grande école. So maybe you could say something more about how this is a kind of apparent case.
Right.
Can you take a couple more?
Okay.
All right, ready?
Okay, thank you. It was great listening to you. So my point is in relation to your methodology, and I guess to my people towards the concern. So I'm not entirely sure about your the strength of your historical ethnography. So because if you put aside context, even what Jade suggested, in a sense, then your method presents some sort of weaknesses. So that at least my point of view. So I don't know how you would probably address that. And also, yes, Foucault doesn't identify himself as a Marxist. But if you read carefully his work, even some of his work are not translated into English, so you will get a sense that he is at some point quoting Marx without necessarily, putting quote or quotation of things. So I wonder how would you address that, because there's one thing to say, there's one thing to say something and then do the opposite. And yeah.
Any more? Can I ask a question? A few weeks ago at the seminar, there was Ivor Chipping gave a paper about the radicalization of, or the theories in the ANC about radicalizing bureaucracy. And part of this was about just departing from a kind of Weberian idea that the state can be this objective entity, that in fact the state has to be politicized in every moment of its bureaucratic operation. And I wonder if the kind of, you present a contradiction or a tension between a kind of a set of thinking radically about the university and day-to-day university practice. And I wonder if among these people there was any kind of attempt to really think more radically about the day-to-day administration of the university, whether that could be appropriated into any kind of radical thought or not.
Yeah. Okay, that is absolutely as many questions as I can answer in a round. Yeah, well, I'll keep going in order. To answer your question, Cheryl, as directly as possible, I wouldn't say that my book project is political. Is very deeply involved at all in kind of trying to think about the place of French higher education kind of in the French political economy in general. I think that there is nothing illegitimate about that project. Maybe that should go without saying, I don't know. And I have tried to kind of engage in, there's a person called Annie Vinucor who is kind of the French indigenous political economist of French higher education. And I have kind of been interested in trying to engage with her work. And I find that it's very hard to kind of bridge the scale between like a global political economy that tries to think about international flows of capital and kind of the international balance of power between, states and flows of capital, and the kind of local details of university life, whether political or not political. And so I guess I would say that I guess I find myself kind of in the position that Sartre is in this book called Search for a Method, where he kind of comments that Marxism is Marxist and political economy, if you like, is a thing, and it does not in itself kind of give you the intermediate system of mediations necessary to get to the bottom of whatever concrete object one may be encountering. So I guess what I would say about myself is that I don't know what those mediations exactly would look like. And I kind of feel that I have already bitten off as much as I can chew, kind of in trying to have this sort of relatively micro-ethnography of a relatively small department. And so I guess I would say, yeah, I don't reject the premise of your question at all. It just isn't kind of, it's not kind of currently the methodological point of departure. I think I'll just leave it at that for right now, because if I go on, I'll be rambling. And there clearly is more to talk about on that front. Yeah, so Rob wants to know, what is in it for me? I mean, it's a good question. If I don't answer it, that might make people feel that I have dodged too. So this is kind of like, it's quite hard to answer in the same set of questions, one's relationship to the large-scale French political economy and one's kind of psychoanalytically rich relationship to one's object. I think I'm going to answer with kind of the most concrete thing that I can say, I think, which is that I found the kind of aging radicals who ran this department by the time that I got there to be just, like, I found them both immensely contradictory and very kind of compelling and sympathetic people. People with whom, towards whom I feel quite a large degree of kind of warmth, if you like, or attachment or something. I don't think I over-identify with them all that much because they're a completely different culture and generation. Well, I shouldn't say completely, but in any case, a different culture and generation from mine. And I was sent home from France with explicit instructions not to romanticize their milieu. And so I think that to the extent that my project does not romanticize their milieu, that in some sense is executing the local preference about their strategy of representation. They do not want to be romanticized and are, I think on some level, are aware that they have to romanticize themselves kind of in public and do not romanticize themselves that much in private. I mean, there's a lot more I can say about this kind of in the present. I don't really have information about this from the 70s that is as good as the data that I gathered just by being in France, you know? So I think that will tell you something about my relationship to my object, I guess. And so the people who I feel invested in are, yeah, I guess are like second and third generation inheritors of this project. The students of the famous people whose books got translated into English and circulated around the world. The famous people were without exception gone by the time that I got there. I think actually this gets back to the question about Foucault and these other people as well. I would like to do kind of a non-great men type reading of this place. And that one of the things that I think that implies is that one should not focus on the great men more than kind of as minimally necessary to make sense of the situation. So it's, I guess, in that sense, it's strategic that the project tries to be a bit, you know, it tries to take these people who are thought of as these kind of taken out of context heroes and just treat them as if they're any other social actor full of kind of ambivalence and role contradiction. And to the extent that they have other things happening intellectually or personally or whatever, I'm kind of indifferent to them in the same way that I'm indifferent to that in most of my interlocutors. I don't, you know, I lived in France for 2 years. It's not enough to become people's kind of like lifetime best friend and confidant and be able to explain every detail of their personal lives. And I think that that's okay. So in that sense, it's not like that humanist to study. And it doesn't have the data to be that humanist to study. Like, I couldn't write a novel, let me put it like this. I couldn't really write the novel about these people because I just don't know enough about their domestic lives and a lot of other things other than what they kind of do. And I mean, imagine yourself like in the corridor here, right, trying to write an ethnography of the lot of us. What you would find out about us would be very limited because the things that are able to be exchanged in a place like the department premises, which is largely where I did research, are very limited by a number of different kinds of structures and conventions. So that's kind of my empirical point of departure, if you like. And so that limits the kind of depth of connection and depth of knowledge that the project is able to have. I know that I'm skirting the question, the more psychoanalytic question, what is in it for me? But I think that the only honest answer to that, right, is that one starts doing a project in a doctoral program for a reason, and the things that keep one invested in the project as one go along really are increasingly disconnected from the things that got one into it in the first place. So I think one would have to give a much longer and more boring autobiography than that to really go through it. But I think the answer is, you know, having a research topic and things do a number of different things for one as a professional academic, and so that there's a career story about myself, I guess. I'm not going to stand in front of everybody and tell. Partly because it's banal. What I wanted to know about the kind of institutional specificity of the institution. And I think I take it, Lloyd, that you're asking me partly just to kind of remind people who may not be too familiar with various French higher education institutions that it's what in France they sometimes call a two-speed system, meaning that there's a set of kind of elite grandes écoles, which are finishing schools basically for the French intellectual state aristocracy. So you can go there and then immediately work for 5 years as a civil servant, or go and work in, have an engineering degree, or work in the French public legal system. In any case, that kind of confer access to French elite status. And then there's the public university system, which in the undergraduate level is largely for the masses who are not able to go to the elite grandes écoles. So the place that I'm studying is firmly in the kind of mass public university part of the system. If you look at the people who are in the doctoral program, it's a bit more elite, if you like, or more high status and more more consecrating, and to borrow a little Bourdieuian bit of jargon. But the undergraduates today are largely working class residents of the immediate surroundings of the university, which is a part of the northern suburbs of Paris and Saint-Denis that now is formerly was kind of the bastion of the communist white working class, and now is heavily North African. And so there's it has massive dropout rates, and is in many ways a very conventional type of urban public university, like mass public university. Anyway, so I don't know if that situates altogether the site, but that's kind of the first order description of kind of where this is as an institution. Do you have any other kind of questions about the institutional specificity? Right, yes. Yes. Right. Well, I may not have time to kind of give the long answer to that either, but the short answer to that is that as long as French higher education was kind of a deeply protectionist and kind of nationally bounded, pre-globalized, if you like, or less globalized field, then this this department and the university did very poorly because it was not integrated kind of into the traditional French system of academic reproduction. And so, to be concrete about this, if you get your doctorate from this place, you probably can't really work. It's very unlikely that you'll be able to get it, especially in the philosophy department. You're essentially blacklisted from working as a tenured academic in French higher education. Because for many years you are considered to be so far in political left field that you probably would not even be given the authorization to apply to a job. You have to get, France has a bureaucracy to rival anywhere else, so you have to get permission by a government agency to apply for a permanent job, and you would systematically not get it if you got a doctorate from the department that I'm writing about. So for a long time it was kind of marginalized in this fashion, such that it ended up finding this flow of non-French students to kind of keep itself alive. And the neoliberal irony of it, if you like, is that starting in last decade, it started to be rated very, very highly once kind of British-style national ranking and auditing agency was brought into existence, because the criteria of evaluation were deeply kind of international, what's the word I'm looking for, were kind of deeply globalized. And so the fact that this department, which previously had been shunned and ostracized, had all these collaborations with foreign universities all over the globe, suddenly meant that it was ranked at the absolute top of the kind of neoliberal assessment scale. So there's kind of a curious ruse of neoliberal history, if you like, having to do with, maybe this does speak a bit to the political economic question in the end, having to do with the kind of shift in French public higher education from a kind of nationally oriented, nationally evaluated system, deeply protectionist system, to a kind of pro-globalist kind of system of governance. So, you know, it's a thing that we may have to talk about afterwards, what this tells you exactly about where my case fits into a kind of neoliberalization story. I guess the really short answer is that it's ironic that a place that is utterly inadmissible by these kind of older, more conservative criteria suddenly can become very highly ranked by a set of quantitative metrics that say, like, the more international students you have and the more international student exchanges and collaborations you have and international publications you have, the higher you're ranked. If you compare this department to, like, the kinds of places written about by British scholars of kind of post-Thatcher neoliberal academia, you just can't imagine that there's a place kind of for a department like this to be highly ranked. It's kind of an accident of history. Because the people in the department are, well, anyway, it's a long story. I think about how to go through the details of what people have said about neoliberal university governance. But I guess I would say, yeah, it has managed to find a curious kind of neoliberal success. But in a way that if you read the dominant literature about what neoliberalization means in Europe, you just would not be able to imagine. This is my contention. Then there's a question, sorry, I'm not sure your name. Thanks. Kind of about the methodological problems of the project. I guess I would say that I mean, there are a number of different ways in which one could approach a project like the one that I'm doing methodologically. And I have selected one that, and this I guess can only be answered by going back to Rob's question about kind of my own investment in the work, one that kind of serves the critical aims that I have in mind. So one way of writing this project would be as kind of an intellectual history that was less interested in kind of micro-interaction and more interested in kind of longer durée changes in left-wing philosophical currents and things like this. And then maybe one would do justice to Foucault. Personally, I cannot think why it would be politically important to do justice to Foucault at this point in history, given the amount of consecration that has already been directed towards Foucault. I think deconsecrating Foucault probably would be in order. But in any case, one would do more justice to Foucault if one had more of a kind of intellectual history stance. One could have done also kind of a more Bourdieuian study, which would have taken us more into the kind of demographics of who comes to the site and what their different kinds of social and intellectual capital were, and kind of the different conflicts between differently positioned actors, if you like, in the French academic field. I think the problem with that type of analysis to me is that at the end you don't end up learning anything conceptually that you didn't know when you started. Like you can read off, you know, people with certain kinds of intellectual trajectories ended up fighting with people from slightly different kinds of social or intellectual trajectories, and people end up accumulating one type of capital or converting one type of capital into another type of capital. And I think, I mean, there's a kind of solidity to that kind of knowledge which French Bourdieuians to this day are practicing in France, and some of that is quite powerful. Yeah, I don't feel like at the end of the day I would kind of I would just come away kind of without much of a theory of the singularity of the site that I'm interested in. And so I guess what I would say is the methodological principle of the project, if you like, is that what I would like to do is come up with concepts that seem to respect, in some sense, the singularity of the site that I'm looking at, and that if that means that they are going to be untrue to kind of some of the other linkages that one could draw out between the site and other parts of France or other parts of French higher education, that's okay with me, because those links can be drawn out in other contexts or in other pieces of work, or one doesn't have to say everything in a given book, right? The book can just do its one piece of work and leave other pieces of work for other places. And I mean, I guess as far as kind of the validity of the kind of the historical ethnography of these particular moments in the site in the 70s. I mean, those of you who have more training in archival research will have to give me more input, but I think that more or less my principle has been to try to assimilate all the archival information that I can come across, which is not total by any stretch of the imagination. It's fragmentary. And to do the best that I can kind of to interpret the evidence that I have. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I will say that if I'm if I'm unfair to Foucault, that in itself is okay with me. I don't think fairness to Foucault is not the goal of the project. Last question from Bernard, kind of about the problematization of administrative labor. Maybe this will be the last question because it's 2:29, I think. You guys have asked marvelous questions, and I'm sorry to have to. Sometimes when one is asked complicated questions, it requires a certain amount of work to kind of even begin to get to them. So sorry to. I can always tell when I teach, that if the water bottle gets down to about there, I've probably talked more than I really should. To answer your question about administrative labor, I mean, administrative labor is not valorized in a site that's deeply political, right? Administrative labor is kind of stigmatized, is kind of is treated as a kind of domestic sphere that is lower status. And so what ends up happening after Foucault leaves the site is that a lower status person more interested in teaching than in research becomes the department chair, who has also this obsolete approach because he's kind of a Hegelian Marxist, which is not the valorized form of intellectual engagement at this point in French history. And he keeps doing the job for the next 14 or 15 years until he retires, or dies, actually. I think he may have more or less died in office. And so there is not a lot of theory of, I think what there is a withdrawal from administrative work and a withdrawal from the idea that a department would be a scene of collectivity. The idea was kind of like, well, if they're going to push back against my exceptionally radical form of engagement with my department, then that doesn't matter, I can just take the paycheck and kind of do what I like. As a result of which you kind of end up with the curious specter of a lot of people all saying that their department kind of has no kind of collective anything whatsoever, and that it's purely kind of an individual space of individual kind of anarchism. I mean, nothing is more patterned than dozens of people all saying the same thing about how individual their trajectory is. But yeah, administrative labor has been shunned and shirked basically throughout for 50 years afterwards. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.